The UK government recently released its strategy for what it calls Jet Zero. You see what they did there? What it's going to do about flying in a world where we tackle climate change. It's been long awaited, and for some it's welcome. For others it fails their key test over what should be done about flying, which from their view is to discourage people from doing it much at all. So what does Jet Zero actually say? What's the real story behind our flying habits and how we approach the issue? Let's have a look. So look, there are two versions of this story. What you do about flying and climate change depends on which of those two stories you accept. The one, promoted by many environmentalists and others, holds that international travel is a low-value activity. Therefore, the environmental damage that it causes sufficiently outweighs the benefit as to make it into a de facto moral bad. Hence the recent upsurge in so-called flight shaming, and hence some of the real extremists, such as Donica McCarthy of Extinction Rebellion, who is in the habit of telling ordinary tourists, holidaymakers, that they are guilty of genocide. That's the dominant story in that specific echo chamber, strongly amplified by a number of those in the mainstream media. Now, the other story holds that international travel is a boon for humankind, something that brings immense value to the people that undertake it, rather summed up by this quote from Mark Twain. Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime. So if international travel is a high-value activity, our response to climate change would be to seek to remove the negative impact of it while preserving its value and affordability to as many people as possible. Now, my bias is that I'm very much in the second camp. Not that I'm especially jetting off around the world at the drop of a hat, but I generally take the opportunities that come my way, never apologise for it, and don't expect to any time in the future. Let me put it this way. Here's an average flight with a Boeing 747, carrying 333 passengers, travelling a distance of 5,556 kilometres in 6.5 hours. The approximate CO2 emissions per passenger from that flight would be 1.6 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. Here's the same flight, with the same number of passengers, some of whom are sitting in their seats, feeling tremendously guilty about it. Weirdly, all that guilt has zero impact on the climate emissions, which remain at 1.6 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. So you might as well be joyful about the privilege of experiencing something as amazing and life-enhancing as being able to travel the world.
Everybody on every plane should just constantly be going, oh my God! Wow! Yes! You're sitting in a chair in the sky. Yes.
The fact is, whether it's my bias or not is irrelevant. If you do a search on flying on YouTube, I see a bunch of results about the adventure of travel, a lot of advice on how to hack the process of travel to enjoy it more. Nothing from the environmentalist echo chamber, even though it's me doing the search, and I watch a lot of climate-themed content, something that YouTube's algorithm would be taking into account when I do my search. Now, your experiment with that might differ, but the point is there are a lot of people who love to travel, plain and simple. Pre-pandemic, we'd all heard about the problems of climate change over and over, and yet flying was still growing at 5% per year. It is not a low-value item then, it's a very basic human instinct. And governments see it as high value in another way, of course, which is the contribution that it makes to the economy. In the UK, the government reports that aviation contributed £22 billion per year to the economy pre-pandemic, directly providing at least 230,000 jobs. It's not solely a UK phenomenon, obviously, with pre-pandemic scheduled flights at nearly 38 million, carrying 4.3 billion passengers over 54 billion kilometres. That has a big impact on every single economy. The UK also benefits from manufacturing some of the hardware. Aerospace exports over £34 billion, which is a market share of 13% in the global market. So what do we know about why people fly? The largest percentage is leisure travel. 53% of US residents flying abroad were taking holidays, according to one study. 27% were visiting friends and relatives. Business travel, including internal and external meetings, attending conferences, going to trade shows, that counted for 13%. Bear in mind, businesses certainly traditionally place a high value on the benefits of flying, hence their willingness to pay extraordinary price premiums on business class travel. I know various people say that now everyone's discovered Zoom video conferencing, that will no longer be the case. Well, I'm not so sure. I think it'll take a while, but I'm pretty sure it will go back. People often talk about business travel in terms of people's personal flying, which I find faintly ridiculous. I saw someone moaning about the frequent flying status of UK Prime Minister candidate Liz Truss the other day. She flew a lot. Well, yeah, she was a foreign secretary. It's kind of built into the job title. I mean, how absurd does it get? People sometimes talk about the hypocrisy of people lecturing others that they shouldn't fly while attending international conferences in their private jets. Well, that would indeed be hypocritical, but I've not seen many, apart from aforementioned Donachan McCarthy and his ilk, preaching to others about how much they can fly. People just infer that argument onto anyone who thinks we should try to tackle climate change. It doesn't necessarily follow. Anyway, back to where we were. Then 7% is shared between other reasons that people fly. To participate in or spectate sporting events, for instance, migration, pilgrimage, to undertake studies abroad, to obtain health services, and then a bunch of other minor things. How does this go across the wider population? Well, it varies from country to country, as you would expect, and particularly between relatively affluent countries and relatively poorer ones. One study that looks at UK travellers identified that just around over 50% of the population didn't fly at all in an average year, using the data from 2006 to 2017. About 25% of people took one flight per year, and then smaller percentages respectively for 2, 3, 4 and 5 flights per year. And ultimately, what environmentalists most often focus on is that it is a very small minority of people who take the majority of flights. One study by Books and Mattioli, based on the National Travel Survey, found that around 75% of the flights were taken by just 20% of the people. If you take global average figures, that makes the distinction rather more stark. The majority of the global population, nearly 90%, hardly ever get onto a plane at all. Only 11% flew even once in 2018, our fondly remembered pre-pandemic days. It's those sorts of figures that then lead people to come up with proposals, not that flying per se should be made more expensive, but there should be a frequent flyer tax. In other words, that larger group that flies just the once or never, no barriers should be put in their way, and that's the majority of people after all. But then the price goes up from there, and in the minds of environmentalists goes up rather sharply. So if you want to take a holiday and go back home to visit your mum on her 70th birthday, then you're into the expensive category. And that was one of the suggestions that the UK Committee on Climate Change put forward with its net zero proposals for its section on transport, and which the UK government has specifically not added to the Jet Zero strategy. We'll come to that in just a minute. But first, it's worth noting, of course, that having established flying as high value, it is indeed, as so often rehearsed, also high impact. The sector accounts for 2% of global CO2 emissions, but that's not the whole of it. A recent study, Lee et al. 2021, looks at the contribution made of global aviation in the 18 years between 2000 and 2018. It found that when you added in all the impacts, it actually added up to 3.5% of the warming impact caused by humans. That added impact largely comes from contrail cirrus clouds and the emissions of nitrogen oxides. Contrail cirrus clouds form when water vapour in the atmosphere condenses onto particulates that have been emitted from the aircraft. If the temperatures are cold enough, clouds of ice crystals form, and if they persist, they can spread from the lines that you see behind jet aircraft into large thin sheets of cirrus clouds. Such clouds have an overall warming signal because they trap outgoing infrared radiation, although that's less than it would have been because it also happens to reflect solar radiation back out into space during the day. So such clouds have both warming and cooling effects, but the balance is slightly on the warming side. The other effects also form a complex mix of warming and cooling effects. Nitrogen oxide plays a part in the formation of ozone, another greenhouse gas, helps to destroy methane, which has a cooling effect. Aircraft emissions reduce water vapour in the stratosphere, which has a cooling contribution. But overall, the effect of nitrogen oxide is warming. Now, these effects come first and foremost, of course, because aircraft burn significant amounts of fossil fuels. And to date, that has been the only way, because you need a fuel that is extremely power dense. You're seeking the most thrust for the weight of fuel. And that's a problem with an idea that you might have purely electric planes, for instance. The battery for such a plane would add masses of extra weight and then wouldn't be able to replicate the power of a jet engine anyway. So, mostly action to reduce the impact of flying has tended to focus on alternative fuels, trying to locate a holy grail of a non-carbon based high energy fuel. That focuses on possible solutions such as hydrogen. Airbus has said that it plans hydrogen-fueled planes within 15 years. The European Union believes that by 2050, hydrogen technology could have reduced the industry's emissions by up to 75%. Well, that's almost certainly over-optimistic, but it is an indicator of the scale of investment that is already in progress. The alternatives to that are biofuels made from crops, algae, or even from waste, or synthetic fuel, potentially made from CO2 captured from the air. And of course, because of the technical difficulties that remain to be solved on that, a lot of people call for demand reduction. Don't fly as much, basically. So this brings us at last to the government's Jet Zero plan. Remember, the UK is committed right now, notwithstanding what might happen with a new Prime Minister, to net zero carbon by 2050. The Jet Zero strategy, setting that out in terms of aviation, says that all domestic flights should be net zero by 2040 and all airport operations in England to be zero by the same year. Progress towards those targets to be reviewed every 5 years. The government says it will work with other countries through the International Civil Aviation Organization because it's obviously not something that can be solved by one country alone. It argues that given the importance of the aviation sector to the country, the argument should therefore not be that aviation is too important to change, but that it's too important not to change. Now, I hear echoes in that of the process that the motor industry, particularly in the United States, went through, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, where American motor manufacturers went to great lengths to lobby Congress to fight off enhanced fuel efficiency standards so they wouldn't have to spend so much money improving their cars. Meanwhile, the Japanese manufacturers like Toyota and Honda spent the money, having made the long-term assessment that it was inevitable and there would be an economic benefit to being the first movers. And within a rather short period of time, their electric hybrid vehicles became the next generation of eco-cars that Hollywood wanted to be seen driving, and Toyota became the #1 car brand in the US, something nobody would have predicted. Arguably, the civil airline industry is a couple of decades behind where the motor industry is now, given that the technical problems are even harder ones to solve. But there's no reason why the process shouldn't be the same. And the sector does seem to understand that, and is keen to learn from their mistakes. 290 airlines, through the International Air Transport Association, have committed to net zero emissions by 2050. Which I personally don't think is possible, but it nevertheless signifies the intent to make significant progress. The government says that it's committing to have 5 UK plants manufacturing what it calls sustainable aviation fuels, SAFs. These are things like biofuels. Biofuels have disadvantages. Producing them via crops is the lowest power dense approach you can come up with, meaning it will take lots of land out of other uses. They do have the advantage that they're so-called drop-in fuels, able to be used by existing planes and They're currently commercially viable, although nowhere near the scale that could decarbonise the sector. I think at best they could be staging posts towards better solutions, which won't necessarily stop people trying to push them quickly to a scale that will have unintended consequences, because people can be a bit blinkered like that. Then we come to the question of demand management, finding ways to get people to fly less. Now, here's the thing. The government generally says it is not taking this approach, to the deep annoyance of environmentalists for whom it's become an article of faith. This is the key statement. Under the heading, "We will continue to support sustainable airport growth," it says this: "Through our consultations, we received a high volume of responses about the desire for demand management measures to reduce aviation emissions." I kind of bet you did. Our approach for decarbonising aviation will focus on the rapid development of technologies, on operational improvements in the near term, use of SAF, adoption of ZEF, zero emission fuels, in the longer term, and continued use of markets and removal measures. And it concludes by saying this: our analysis shows that the sector can achieve jet zero without the government needing to intervene directly to limit aviation growth. This is very much taking the view, as I outlined at the start, that flying is a high-value activity with an impact that must be reduced while maintaining its benefits, rather than as a moral bad to simply be given up. But there is a huge but lurking in the shadows here. That's what it says, but it's not quite as simple as it sounds. Another part of the strategy says this: carbon markets will have a key role in delivering jet zero by establishing a price signal on emissions and a decarbonisation trajectory. Carbon markets help decarbonise and incentivise investment in technologies that reduce carbon emissions. Now, that actually is a demand measure using the price mechanism. It's put under the cover that it would help to drive innovation in cleaner technology, but ultimately, if you put the price up, you will see a reduction in demand. Right now, that hardly seems necessary. The price of aviation fuel, like everything else, has shot up during the year. I suppose you might want to put a floor below which it shouldn't fall, but simply whacking another layer of government taxation onto the price, it's just going to price out some of those people who crave their 1 or 2 foreign holidays per year. The environmentalists particularly will hate that, because their largely left-wing political instincts want to penalise the rich people, the ones who fly often, not to increase the price generally, making flying a luxury good out of reach of the poorest. But realistically, any country that sought to introduce the sort of quotas and punitive taxes that some envisage would quickly discover how, in an international market, how many loopholes there would be to get around such measures, and how ultimately you would probably simply disadvantage your home industry to the enrichment of someone else's, with very little reduction, if any, in actual flying. But the real point is this: the money for investment in new technologies and for the drive and energy for innovation will not come from governments. It will come from the sector that stands to benefit. A thriving air transport sector is best placed to invest. They can be put under pressure to speed that investment up. But if that pressure involves gutting the sector, reducing flights massively in the short term on some moralistic flying is bad basis, then you cut off your nose to spite your face. Short term, you would reduce the benefits of flying to people and to economies, and you would slow down and stymie the process of innovation to enjoy those benefits without the impact, because you would have ravaged the profits that would fund that investment. What you will have noticed, though, is that although the strategy is titled Jet Zero, it does not get emissions from air travel to zero, not by 2050, realistically not within a couple of decades of that. It's not a surprise. This is one of the hardest reduction problems to solve, hence why the sector ends up as one of those whose emissions are left to be offset, the net part of net zero, projected to be around 19.3 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. That doesn't satisfy the environmentalist critics, of course. For example, one described it as the government playing a get-out-of-jail-free card. And he went on to argue for the demand reduction policies, particularly the frequent flyer levy, as well as a limitation on airport expansion. What he doesn't observe, mind, is that even if you brought those policies in, wouldn't get rid of 19.3 million tonnes of CO2, might reduce it by a little, although I suspect the frequent flyer stuff will be less effective in reducing flying than it will be in raising revenue. So really it's more about the traditional obsession on changing people's behaviours and making symbolic gestures, more than it is about actually practically reaching zero emissions. So look, what's the takeaway for all of this? We have a fundamental choice. Whether we see this area as a difficult engineering problem to solve in defence of something that we value, which is the ability to travel around the world, to see it in all its beauty and glory as well as all its harshness and depravity, or to see it instead as a moral question of something that we indulge only because we're weak and for which there are only downsides. The Jet Zero strategy goes firmly to the first of those. Its critics tend to attack it from the platform of the second, all the while failing to even notice that they're mostly arguing from different premises. By the way, I mentioned the fact that environmentalists dismiss carbon capture as a get-out-of-jail-free card. You can imagine the fury that ensued when the IPCC itself heavily relied on them in its latest report. I talked about that and the science behind the technology in this video here. If you made it this far, you'll definitely want to watch that one next.